Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Linda Kass to discuss her new novel, A Ritchie Boy, published by She Writes Press. In this moving and memorable novel in stories, inspired by her father's life, Linda Kass shares the little-known account of the Ritchie Boys. Often Jewish, German-speaking immigrants, the Ritchie Boys worked in U.S. Army intelligence and helped the Allies win World War II. Linda Kass began her career as a magazine writer and correspondent for regional and national publications. Along with the Ritchie Boy, she's the author of the historical World War II novel Tassa's Song, which Publishers Weekly called a memorable tale of unflinching courage in the face of war and the power of love and beauty to flourish amid its horrors. A longtime civic leader, Linda is the founder and owner of Gramercy Books, an independent bookstore in Central Ohio. This makes her one of our own. To moderate this evening's presentation is Dr. Oren Stier. Dr. Stier is the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program and professor of religious studies at Florida International University, where he also directs the Jewish Studies Certificate Program. He's the author of Holocaust Icons Committed to Memory, Cultural Meditations of the Holocaust, and co-editor of Religion, Violence, Memory, and Place. Dr. Stier teaches and lectures widely on the Shoah, as well as on issues in religion and violence and contemporary Jewish studies. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can find a Ritchie Boy for purchase at Books and Books below by pressing the green button. Every purchase you make helps keep Books and Books up and running, so press away. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the stage. There you are.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Christina. Great to be here.
So, Linda, I'm so thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you in this medium. It's really exciting, and it's amazing the way we're able to use technology right now to be able to bring your writing out to a wider audience. There are so many historical aspects to your wonderful novel that I think really important to bring out for a conversation. Obviously, the story of the Ritchie Boys figures most prominently. But before we get into that, I actually wanted to ask you about the context for the immigration story, which is really at the heart of the narrative. Nothing would occur in the novel without the fundamental immigration of the protagonist and his family to the U.S. And all of that is facilitated by So I was wondering if you could say something to start us off about.
So thank you, Oren. That's a great opening. You know, the protagonist in the story, Eli Stoff, comes from sponsorship of a generous Jewish businessman who agreed to sign the affidavits to allow Eli Stoff and his parents to escape Vienna, Austria in 1938, right after the Anschluss, when Germany took over Austria. And being a sponsor means that you are responsible for that family or that individual that you're signing for, so that they are not that you're in terms of financial state and whatnot. So they're not a burden to the state, so to speak. So it is, there were at that time, certainly quotas, and it was much harder to get into this country. Many papers, much material, certain deadlines, all kinds of things were required to immigrate, and the most important was having a sponsor.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always find with my students, I'm just sorry to interrupt. Every couple of seconds, there's some terrible noise that comes in, like somebody's rubbing their microphone against their lapel, or I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm saying that only so Christina hears it and maybe she can figure out what's going on. But hopefully the audio for everyone else joining in is sounding good. So one of the things I find that's really very striking about the whole issue of immigration during the specifically, that comes out specifically for my students is the huge burdens as well as responsibilities, burdens on people trying to emigrate, and we often forget that the story of immigration is not simply, a family wants to pick up and just move and they can therefore do that. There are governmental policies that have to be surmounted. There are documents that have to be assembled. It's incredibly hard to get out of a country, and it's also incredibly hard to get into a country. And I think what really strikes me about the character of John Brandeis, the sponsor in the novel, is his altruism. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that act of selflessness that is central to the narrative.
Sure. When I began approaching this novel, as I think Christina has mentioned and you have mentioned, this novel was inspired by my own father, who was a Ritchie boy, and there are certain specific facts of his life that have found their way into the invention of characters and invention of actions that take place. And one of these is this character you mentioned, John Brandeis, who is a sponsor. He did not know the family, and there was a friend of Eli's mother who she writes to early in the novel. There's a letter that comes to this friend. The friend had immigrated to the United States many years earlier, and she is the one who finds John Brandeis. He's not a man she knew either, because she was not in that social strata. John Brandeis was a wealthy Jewish retailer. And I have John Brandeis living in New York City, where the friend Zelda Mooney also lives. And I might add that Zelda Mooney was not Jewish. And yet she knew she needed to find someone, and she came across this Jewish businessman. So there's as we said, interrelated stories that all are focused on the main character, Eli Stoff, the young man who comes from Vienna, leaves his homeland at 15 in 1938 and comes to the United States. And every single story is about him and told by different characters. And Zelda Mooney is one character, and she tells this story that introduces John Brandeis, the man who ended up sponsoring this family, and because of that, gave them life.
Yeah, it's an amazing aspect of the story. So let's talk about the Ritchie Boys. A lot of people, I don't think they've ever heard of Ritchie Boys, and it's such a critical part of the narrative. What can you tell our listeners about the Ritchie Boys and the basis for the whole story?
Sure. Well, in the summer of 1942, and so this is a year after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States joined the war, the United States Army centralized its intelligence operations at Camp Ritchie, which was a remote location in Maryland, near Hagerstown, Maryland, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And the camp had been founded by the Maryland National Guard, but it became the Army's secret intelligence training facility. And over the course, just this is factual, that over the course of the time between June of 1942 and the end of the war, more than 15,000 servicemen were trained at Camp Ritchie, and thus the nickname, they were called the Ritchie Boys. And most of the men sent to Camp Ritchie were assigned there because they were fluent in either German or other languages. Often recent refugees, there were recent refugees, many of them familiar with the culture and the thinking of enemy soldiers. And that's really why they were recruited there. Probably some 15% or so, some number over 2,000 happened to be Jewish refugees born in either Germany or Austria. So these were men that were trained there. They were trained in the interrogation of prisoners. They were trained in the order of battle. They were trained in analysis of aerial documents and translations of documents. And one Army study actually found that 60% of the intelligence collected during World War II came from interrogations conducted by the Ritchie Boys.
And on top of that, you know, it's also just such an incredible thing to imagine that these young men, some of whom were, you know, practically fresh off the boat, so to speak, in this new safe place, were actually going back to the European theater to essentially support the war effort for their newly adopted country against their former country.
Exactly. So it was just a personal war for them in many ways.
Yeah. And I think there are some unexpected consequences of that encounter. I was wondering if you would read for us maybe a little bit from the section, the interrogation, if you don't mind.
Sure. Okay. So the interrogation, this story comes around the middle of the book, and it's dated. These stories are dated. So this story is dated January of 1945. It happens to be a time when what we all know of in history, the Battle of the Bulge, took place. It wasn't called the Battle of the Bulge back then, but that's the context. Beyond the prisoner facing him, Eli Stoff saw daylight dimming through the room's single window. Across the table, the young soldier remained silent, staring at his hands, which he clasped tightly on the cold aluminum. A lighter, a broken cigarette, and a black and red enameled Dutch Jongveld membership badge lay to the side. Eli had had the boy empty his pockets before he began his interrogation. Now, several hours in, the January chill seeped through the plaster walls. It was time to get inside Malcolm Schlick's head. Eli lowered his voice and leaned forward. So, you had no choice but to sign on with Hitler's army. You did what you were told. I understand. Eli was trained to understand. He'd arrived in Paris in late December, part of a 6-man military intelligence team. His orders were simple: arrest all Nazis impersonating Allied officers, put them through rudimentary questioning, write up a report. But something about Malcolm Schlick made this case more complex. Eli could not put his finger on it. Schlick still wore the olive drab uniform he'd used to blend into the Paris streets, like so many of the beaten-down Germans trying to evade capture. Last night, Eli had overheard traces of German in Schlick's otherwise fluid French as he bought a paper at the local newsstand. He noticed Schlick's uniform was scruffy, patched with dried mud, probably taken from a dead soldier. Curfew approached, so Eli quickly motioned his MI partner, Henry White, to act as backdrop before he approached the likely imposter. Now the boy, because he was a boy, just a boy at 17, sat in a sterile room in an abandoned villa in Le Bisonet, red blotches flaring up on his neck. Eli couldn't help feeling sorry for Schlick, who he now knew hailed from a village near Salzburg, plucked from his family at 15 to face frontline combat. Whether he joined the German troops of his own volition or under duress was yet to be determined. Eli felt a slight tapping of the boy's foot against the wood floor. "Can I get you a cup of coffee or tea?" he asked him. Malcolm looked up, a sudden shiver twitching through his upper body. "Ja, Kaffee, bitte." That familiar Austrian accented German, it matched up with Schlick's Salzburg narrative. Eli regarded the boy more closely. Malcolm was unskilled in mastering his facial expressions, lacking that mask donned by the men Eli had faced over the past weeks, a mask he would get them eventually to drop. Malcolm seemed unpracticed, too, in arranging his body to hide distress. Fear, not anger, shone through the young Austrian's eyes, pressing on his brows, circling his mouth. Vulnerability spoke in the slack of his shoulders. Eli had been trained to notice these signs as he interrogated suspects and prisoners. He worked to make them feel safe so he could learn more about Nazi plans or troop movements. Anything to better inform Allied forces as they edged toward victory in an insufferable war. That's how he found himself stationed in a town west of Paris, face to face with a member of the Hitler Youth, just 4 years his junior. Eli set down the container of coffee, its steam rising like a genie from an oil lamp. He paused while Malcolm drew the cup to his lips, then pressed on. "When did you learn French?" "My parents sent me to private school south of Salzburg, in Anef." Malcolm kept his head down, his sandy-colored waves falling into his face. "I learned French and English, and we had relatives in France, visited them during summers when I was growing up." Eli's memory of Salzburg was when he had gone skiing in Tyrol on a class trip with his best friend, Toby Wermer, in March of '38. When he saw soldiers with Nazi banners and swastikas at the Salzburg stop on the way back to Vienna, he grasped his uncertain future. "Did you ski in the winters?" "I did, with my father. He started me when I was 3. Malcolm's mouth relaxed for a moment. "But things changed while I was still a young boy. Tell me more about how you became a soldier." Eli went along with the boy's story that he hadn't joined the German army of his own free will, and he purposefully didn't label Malcolm a Nazi. He knew to avoid words that might trigger the young soldier to shut down. It was part of a general avoidance of confrontation Eli had learned long before his interrogation training, from all the times he'd been spat at, insulted, and bullied in his own neighborhood. "They came to my school in '39. I was 12 after the Anschluss. Hitler Jugend membership became compulsory for me. Nazi party reps were always coming to speak." Malcolm's eyes seemed unfocused and distant as he continued. They talked about how Hitler's youth organization developed future officers, made it seem an honor, a stepping stone. There were gatherings, events, special uniforms. Boys as young as 10 were recruited. Many of my friends were excited to join. "You weren't?" Eli remembered the pressures in Austria bubbling up and penetrating the broad consciousness of his non-Jewish neighbors, the friends of his family, or the workers at his father's factory. Propaganda about the superiority of the Aryan race and against the Jews was ubiquitous. He could still see his classmates' eyes widen, taking in those uniforms in the train station on the way back from Tyrol. He understood the pull on an impressionable boy wanting to belong to something.
Thank you. You know, your writing does so much to get into the head of a character. Linda, I'm wondering if it's actually coming from you. I don't know. But so getting into the head of the character, and Eli also, his job is really to get into the head of the character, right? And it makes me want to ask you about the process of writing this, about creating all these characters and these different voices, and what that was like for you, and really especially what's true and what's not in these interlocking narratives.
Well, let me speak to maybe the part that I read, the interrogation, which is one story, because I know a number of the viewers might not have read the book yet, so I don't want to spoil parts for them. But I guess what I would say is that, so my father, I mentioned it, was a Ritchie boy. So in terms of what's true, he did interrogations, and they did requisite villas outside of Paris, and was stationed there during this period of time. So I knew he did interrogations. He never ever talked to me about anything specific about any interrogation he would have done. I just knew very basic facts. In terms of getting into the head, I guess I would say to you that so when you're writing a history book, you're learning about what happened, and when you're writing and reading historical fiction, you're sort of present in that narrative because it's building sort of a human story, and you are getting into the head of these characters. So you as a reader can then experience and be present in that narrative. So you're able then to be moved by what happened, not just know what happened. So that is part of the whole fictional, process. I will say I started out as a journalist. So my early training was as a journalist, and I worked as an investigative magazine journalist early in my career. So about a dozen years ago, when I pivoted to fiction writing, I love history, and I love historical fiction, and I love research. So it was the right sort of space for me to be in. So, really you kind of build, you build a story around characters. And when you're doing historical fiction, there's a lot of research involved, and the research is really of all these concrete items that are part of your story, whether they're the settings or whether they're the music that people listen to, or the books they read, the food they eat. These all have to be authentic. You have to create the verisimilitude of that era. And so those are the things that must be factual in historical fiction, so that the reader believes what your story. But then what the character feels, thinks, says, and does is really something you create, something you invent, something you imagine, and you balance sort of those particular concrete details and that which is invented.
So you interviewed your father and your mother. Your first novel is actually based on your mother's story. So Did he tell you some of these personal aspects that you were able to use in the fiction, or did you kind of differentiate between taking, taking the family history, family testimony, and kind of keep that separately, keep that separate from the creative process?
Well, let me say that just a kind of basic background. So I'm a first generation American, Jewish American. My mother was from Eastern Poland, the part that's now Ukraine, but she lived through the war. My father, on the other hand, like Eli Stoff, was 15 in 1938 and sponsored to come to this country. So he grew up in an anti-Semitic Vienna. I did know this because I did, as you mentioned, interviewed both of my parents. The journalist in me wanted to get the facts of my history for my children and grandchildren going forward because it was so precious. Their lives were so different than what I was experiencing as a young American. I interviewed them when I was in my late 20s on audio tape, typed it into a typewriter, and I stuck those papers into a drawer for many decades, really. But I learned during that time, in terms of my father, that he grew up in this very anti-Semitic environment in the 1920s and 30s in Vienna, and that he escaped with his parents thanks to the kindness of a stranger. That he lived out his teenage years in the Midwest. And as World War II began, and thanks to his understanding of German culture and language, he was recruited to the Central Intelligence Facility in Maryland, Camp Ritchie. He then returned, as so many thousands others, returned to the theater of war, not even 6 years after he came to this country. To fight the enemy he barely escaped in 1938. So that's what I knew. And from that, I created, this story of this young boy who becomes a man, goes from one homeland to another, and he goes from Vienna to New York to Ohio to Maryland, to outside of Paris in Europe, and then back, to set down roots in this country. I had to imagine the people and the circumstances that shaped this young man. I had to walk in his shoes, because, as I said earlier, in the end, it's really telling the story is really through what the character thinks and feels and says and does. And that just happens on the page.
Yeah, I think it's really an amazing thing that historical fiction allows us to get in touch with not just the events, but also the people, in a way that I think academic history certainly will struggle to do. So it makes me think again about that, the issue of recording family history and the responsibility we have to our families and to really a broader sort of culture. I mean, how many of us have these stories that are available to us that haven't been recorded? I think of my own family's history and the boxes of photographs that my parents have. These old photographs that often they're not labeled, and it's this aspect of time that is just slipping away. So one of the things historical fiction does is kind of preserve that, as it were. There's a photograph that figures prominently in the narrative, and I don't want to give anything away, but what is how do you, I guess, thinking more about the craft of writing, do you envision the photographs? Do you think visually when you write these? Did you work off of photographs that your parents shared with you or that you had? How did you interact with those as you were crafting these narratives?
I love working with visuals, and they're either visuals that I have or visuals I even find in my research. Um, uh, for me, that's very helpful. And I did have, old. My father had these worn albums, and I actually refer in the prologue of the book to an album, and there was some truth in that album, because that kind of an album is something that my father had, and with the little four corners and the pictures that are sort of tilted and some of them sliding out, the worn pages. And I found some incredible pictures, and some of them I just took and kept at my desk. When I was doing the story about Camp Ritchie, um, that story is told by one of the, uh, there's four young men, including Eli Stoff, who are cabin mates. And the story is told by one of them, Henry White. And I found a photograph of four men, my father and three other men in Army uniforms. They just looked so happy together. And, I just looked at them and imagined Henry White, Max Schultz, and Bobby Saltman, these three characters that I invented. And the four of them became like brothers, really. And, I was able through them to tell the history story of what Camp Ritchie was, and put them inside of Camp Ritchie, and put them inside of a classroom. And so, yes, that's a great question, because those photographs are essential to me personally as a novelist of history.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to ask you, and I also want to remind the listeners that to type questions in, and I'll happily field them for Linda. But I wanted to ask you, because you're not just a writer of books, you're a seller of books, and being as how this is a books and books event, and it's sort of part of the broader family of booksellers and book lovers. What's it like to have that dual role of being both an author and a businesswoman?
That's a great question. There's some really incredible parallels, I think I would say to you. One is resilience and perseverance, and another is creativity. And I think my fellow booksellers, I would have to say that they have great resilience. Certainly, if you're looking at Books and Books, and I thank the people at Books and Books, and certainly Christina and Mitchell Kaplan, who founded Books and Books. These independent booksellers have been around for decades, and there's been the story of the demise of independent booksellers for many years, whether it was from the big box retailers to the launch of the online Amazon platform in the mid 1990s to the advent of the Kindle e-reader. All these circumstances were supposedly the demise of the independent bookseller, and yet they're all still around. And, many of them learn to reinvent themselves, learn to pivot, learn to figure out how to operate in a changed environment. And so, I think that a lot of, the skills that are needed to write and stick with a book, are there in terms of running a bookstore, and certainly a bookstore in a pandemic. I mean, this is quite a overwhelming for all retailers, but specifically for bookstores, we're such a touch and relate kind of business. We're a hand selling business. We talk to our customers. We hand sell books. We're you're in the store and you're browsing the books. And when we all had to shut down, we had to turn into online, an online operation. And yet booksellers started offering curbside pickup. They started delivering books to people's homes. They started hand selling on the telephone. We did all these things too. And, we kept going. It's been tough. And for some, it's tougher than others, but we keep going, and we're going to keep going. I believe that we're here to stay, and we're going to get over this, this bump as well.
Your optimism is contagious. So it's a great time for a question from Pat. Where do you write or like to write? Are you sitting in your writing room? And also related to your research, do you research online? Do you use secondary or primary sources? What is your insight on both of these?
Okay, so first, my writing space. I even had someone asked me to write some blog on my writing space, and I was saying that, yeah, this is my office. I happen to live above my bookstore, and so I'm down there a lot, and I'm up in my office. This is my office, and I have a lot of books you can see behind me. Because I do so much research, I wanted to have a lot of books at my fingertips because I research a lot of things. I have books on writing. I have fiction and nonfiction, and I have lots of books that I can refer to, many books about World War II. So to the question about the research, that kind of segues into that. So I do reference, and for this book particularly, I referenced a lot of books, both fiction and nonfiction. I referenced films and documentaries. There was actually, when I realized, I knew my dad trained at Camp Ritchie, but I never knew there was a name for him, that he was a Ritchie boy. And that kind of happened sort of by chance one day when I was at his apartment years ago, and he kind of passed an envelope, a letter over onto my lap, and he said, "Look at this." And it was a letter that was addressed to Dear Ritchie Boy, and asked him to attend a reunion of Ritchie Boys. And I was kind of perplexed. I said, "What do you mean, Ritchie? What's this Dear Ritchie Boy?" And my dad, said to me, "Well, I trained at Camp Ritchie." But again, I didn't know there was a name for him. And so when I did research and I looked up, once I left, the journalist in me, I found a 2004 documentary that was called The Ritchie Boys. And I got a lot of foundational information about the Ritchie Boys at that time. And certainly my primary source was my father. I did, as I mentioned earlier, interviewed him decades ago, but I had some very basic information. I didn't really have all the details. I also, talked, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and Ohio State University is here. And I had consulted with certainly the library at Ohio State. I have the character attending Ohio State University, and I had to be able to understand Ohio State University during wartime. And so I went to their archives, and I went through 2 to 3 years worth of the college newspaper that's still around today called The Lantern. And in addition to that, there was a professor of European history who I consulted, and also had him as one of my beta readers to make sure that I had full accuracy in what I was writing about. So there's just a whole range of elements of research that I undertook to write this book.
Great, thank you. And I hope that everyone can hear me without my headphones on. So more questions came in. Jean has asked, did any Ritchie boys who returned to Europe with the other troops fall into the hands of the Nazis? I guess captured prisoners of war.
I'm certain that, that happened. That wasn't something I researched as part of this story, so I can't really address that specifically. But I'm sure that yes, that did happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that it was a dangerous, somewhat undercover kind of assignment, and it was, it was very fraught. I mean, they were essentially right there behind the front lines and trying to weed out different elements within the German army who were trying to escape, let's say. So, yeah, I'm sure that happened. Another question. Donna asks, in crafting the characters such as the 17-year-old who wanted to fit in and ended up in the Nazi army, how can we use this knowledge as educators and community members in today's world?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think that I think that this character, who on the surface appeared to be a Nazi, but as the interrogation continued, and I didn't read into that when I was doing my reading, but as the interrogation continued, this young man was part of the Hitler Youth, and he did not want to join. He, really was somewhat forced to join. And I would say at the end of the story, you have a very different impression of him than you did going in. So I think as educators, I think it's important to understand that our first impressions may not be the reality, because there's so many layers to each one of us and what we have experienced and in who we are. So that would be the message from this story, I think.
Yeah, I just think as a reader, I mean, you really play with our expectations in terms of what we think and what we assume, and then what we come to understand later on. And I also found it just, and this is for all of the characters in the novel, you represent such a wide variety of voices, and it really allows us to practice empathy. And there are a couple of moments, that are dotted throughout that are particularly fraught and challenge our empathy. And I think, as educators, that's always the key, right? If we can become more empathetic people, then we've done our job.
Yeah. We've often say that in fiction, reading more and more fiction and, traveling, into people's lives, people who we would know otherwise, we're able to experience that and become more empathetic. And I'd also add that, it sort of reminds me of the line from To Kill a Mockingbird, when Atticus Finch says to Scout that you have to walk in someone's shoes, to really understand them. And that's exactly what this is walking into these characters' shoes, into their minds, and getting really a sense of who they are. So it's empathy. Yeah.
So, I wanted to ask, there are more. So Jean asks, how does the protagonist come to terms with his resentment of the anti-Semitism that he experienced as a youth? Yeah, and I also want to add, just, because there's another character there that his relationship with his childhood friend. I I don't want you to give away too much, but I just would love it if you could kind of fold that in terms of not just the anti-Semitism he experienced, but how he sees things through, his friend's eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, this character, when you read this book, I think the character I created, Eli Stoff, is a really kind character. I think, he's unusually grounded by a loving family, and he's mature in certain ways. He comes over as a 15-year-old, having been spit on and bullied, and yet grateful, very grateful to be in America and to have a second chance. So I think that there's one story where he's still in Vienna and he goes on a ski trip. And the story is told by his best friend, who is a Gentile, and it's a class-sponsored ski trip. And all the students they're Gentiles. There's one particular boy who is very crude, and clearly it's coming from his family. It's coming from things he's heard, and there's certainly a lot of already this anti-Jewish feeling, in the country and in the school. So, the main character, Eli, he sort of he somewhat ignores it until he can't. At the end of that story, and it's in the end of that story, it's really because of his friend and protecting his friend than it is so much of him standing up for himself, because he knows that if he says too much, that he'll just make his situation worse. So he knows to keep quiet.
And there's another question here. Miriam asks, did your father or any other Ritchie boys read the book and provide feedback?
My father read, before he passed away, he had read 2 chapters. And he didn't, pardon me?
Which ones?
The skiing in Tyrol, and the Interrogation. And he didn't really give me feedback on that. He liked them, but he didn't really comment. My dad was, he was someone who really didn't, I wouldn't have expected him to make comments about that, actually. But he liked the story, so I felt that I was on the right path.
And did any other Ritchie boys read it, or were you in touch with any other Ritchie boys, whether they knew your father or not?
Not during, but after. Yeah, I've had a number of Ritchie boys contact me. Not Ritchie boys, actually, but descendants of Ritchie boys, nephews of Ritchie boys. Understand that, the Ritchie boys now, many of them are deceased. And my own father lived a very long life and passed away in 2017 at the age of almost 94. So they really weren't a source for me, other than those 4 or 5 Ritchie boys who were on the documentary. That was the documentary I saw featured 4 or 5 Ritchie boys, and they were interviewed, but they were alive in 2004. They weren't alive when I was writing this book between 2015 or 2014 and now.
Yeah. It's, it's not just that it's an kind of an unknown or largely unknown part of the story, but it's really about this, this curious linkage between, an America that, was I don't want to say exactly isolationist, but was didn't want to get involved in the war, didn't want immigrants. There were quotas and there were limitations on immigration. And then there's just this kind of one point that sort of jumps out, that the entire, cadre of Ritchie Boys depends on really their immigrant status and turns it to a positive. And I know you spoke about that a little bit before, but it does strike me that we live in an era now that has some resonances in terms of the resistance to immigration, going it alone in the world, and I'm wondering who are our Ritchie Boys right now.
I didn't hear the very end of
What do you think about the potential parallels between the historical era that you write about in your novel and today?
Yeah. Well, today there's a lot different. You did mention that there were quotas, and you mentioned that that Americans did not want to enter World War II, and they did not want more immigration. I mean, that was just clear. But the world, back then there were 3 billion people in the world, and what do we have today? 7.5 billion people, and so the numbers are, it's just, all the numbers are different, and there's certainly people that I think that today immigrants offer so much. We are a diverse nation, and a rich nation because of that diversity. And so I'm not sure I can answer who are the Ritchie Boys today, but there's really cultural heritage of persecution followed by resilience and survival, and that's a common story of all immigrants. Where there's a persecution that's leading often to the desire to immigrate, and it they come to this country and survive, and not only survive but thrive and contribute so much to our culture. So there are those parallels, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, one of the things that strikes me about the novel is that it's not just one immigration story, or one family's immigration story, but so many of the characters in the novel are immigrants who came at different times and had different experiences. I'm thinking of the Moonies and their struggles in the Lower East Side, and you represent, it's so poignant, this aspect that often people don't recognize, is that immigrants who have such a high level of expertise and professional training in their countries of origin, and they come and they need to clean toilets to make a living,
right, exactly,
tables or wash dishes, and I don't want to say about kind of how things turn out for the Moonies. I don't want to give too much away, but I wonder if in some ways we've lost sight of the sacrifices that immigrants make for the sake of their family and their children and their future, that I think your book really bring out and remind us of, as well as the amazing success stories. I mean, getting back to the John Brandeis character and the whole concept of those who made it and who give back. In some ways, I think he's really another one of the heroes,
mm-hmm.
because it's his own immigrant story, right? But his was a generation earlier, and so he has that opportunity now to kind of to give back.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. Oren. And I don't know that when I was writing the book, I ended up putting so much immigration into all these different stories that they're all made up, like you said, of immigration. And Brandeis, his grandparents were, survived the pogroms in Russia, and so went to Austria and then came to this country. So there was this backstory for so many characters in the different stories, and unites them, and that unites them, and so it is very parallel, back to your earlier question, very parallel to today, and how we are this nation of immigrants, and we so many people have sacrificed and made our lives better for it. So and the thing of the John Brandeis, which is particularly pivotal in this book, is that he kind of became a hero to Eli Staff, and drove Eli to understand who he wanted to become. So this is a book also about becoming, of sort of becoming, coming from one homeland to another, and from a boy to a man, and becoming and being someone. And that's probably why I chose the epigraph I did, which was actually came from a Hamlet. It was a Shakespeare quote that says, "We know what we are, but not what we may be." And that's true of all of us. We're when we're really young, we have no idea where we're going. And so, this was quite a story of a young man who was waiting to see what he was going to become as he came to this new country, and had these experiences and these wonderful people that crossed his life, and who he became. So.
Yeah, I think you've shown really in this novel, how much one's personal circumstances can feed into the creation of who we all become, and the importance of that individual journey, and related to not just an immediate family, but really a broader family, an entire community of responsibility. And I think that, for me, that's what tied it all together. I want to give you a chance to say the last word, as we're probably going to wrap up in another minute or so, unless we have another final question. So, but for me, it's that connection between that individual self-becoming and that entire, really almost a community pitching in, and that it's very much a cliche, but it shows how many different forces create one individual character. And I think the way you drew that out, as inspired by your father's story, is really is terrific.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, community is very important. I think as writers, often we put our own value system into, or our own aspects of our beliefs sort of come into play, whether consciously or unconsciously, as we're writing. And community is certainly a core value of mine. So but that is absolutely so. Is that this individual really gained an entire community, a large community, in the end, as you see in the last story. All the players of his life came together there in the last story. So community is very, very important.
Well, thank you, Linda, so much for sharing with us tonight, and for your fabulous novel, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading. And thank you to Books and Books, and to Christina Nasty and Mitchell Kaplan.
I want to thank you both so much. That was a fascinating conversation. And just remind you that you can order a copy of the Ritchie Boy, by just pressing on the green button at the bottom of the screen, and we will send it right out to you. So please press away. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Oren,
My
for.
pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Books and Books. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you both. And good night. Be well, and we will see you soon, I hope, in real life. Fingers crossed.